Sisters. Okay.
So I'm going to read again from this book, Sisters at Sinai. And this is a book I've read several stories out of already. It was written by Rabbi Jill Hammer. And what she's done is taken stories of the women in the Torah and creatively expanded on them with her own interpretation. But she's also, and I'm going to read it today, she's included midrashim that go with these particular stories. So kind of interesting also to see how she's gotten there. You know, they're sometimes, as we know, very often women in the Torah are only like little footnotes are mentioned, except for perhaps, you know, Esther or Ruth. They're not really mentioned a lot. Oh, now Eric writes me.
Right.
So, you know, she's really taken these and expanded on them to try and give women, sorry, a bigger place and look at their role in a bigger way. Okay, so the story I'm going to read today is called The Mirrors. I need to switch glasses. Okay. Called The Mirrors. And it begins, as all of hers do, with sort of segments out of where she's gotten some of this, her ideas. And the first quote is from Exodus. He made the lavar out of copper, and its base out of copper, from the mirrors of the serving women, the tzovot, who served at the entrance of the tabernacle. And the second quote is, Miriam was a teacher of women. And that's from Targum Mikah. The story begins. When the Israelites received the Torah, they did not, at first, know what to do with it. Parts of it were law, parts of it were story, parts of it were poem. They began to read it and discovered that every time they read it, it had a new meaning. They also discovered that the new revelation seemed more clear if they studied it together. The people were occupied with the task of building the tabernacle and all its furnishings as a dwelling place for God. Yet they also knew that it was an equally important task to study the words that they had been given at Sinai. So at night, when the work of building the tabernacle had ceased for the day, the people began to gather in groups to learn Torah together. Miriam, the prophetess, called together the women who had worked hard all day to spin blue, purple, and scarlet thread for the tabernacle's curtains. They wound their threads into skeins and came to sit in Miriam's tent, where she taught them Torah for hours until their eyes drooped. The very beginning of the Torah fascinated them. They spent many days on the 6 days of creation, probing its mysteries, for they too were engaged in a work of creation. Finally, when they came to the creation of humankind, the women became confused, for they had read this verse. God created the Adam in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. They argued about the meaning of this verse. How could God create one creature that was also two? And how could God create a mortal creature of any gender in God's own image? They had seen on Sinai that the Eternal was a consuming flame. No mortal could approach that presence and live. Miriam listened as the women argued. The debate grew more and more heated. Finally, Miriam said to her disciples, "Go home and fetch your mirrors." The women did not understand this strange request, but they hastened to follow Miriam's request. Each went to her tent to find the mirror that she had looked into when she had braided her hair or painted her eyes. Some opened carved chests of olive wood given to them by their mothers. Some unwrapped bundles of rags. Some begged from neighbor women or from grandmothers. Some brought 2 or 3 mirrors so that others could share. Soon they all came back to Miriam's tent carrying the precious bronze circles. The firelight reflected in the many mirrors made the tent blaze like a palace of light. Then Miriam told the women to look into their mirrors. "What do you see?" she asked. "I see myself," each woman answered. "I see my eyes, which reveal my soul. I see my mouth, which speaks and sings. I see that I am different from everyone else." "Each of you is made in the image of God," Miriam explained. "Your soul and your speech are like God's, and your body is God's dwelling place. Each of you embodies the divine presence in a different way. When you look into the mirror, you see a woman, but you also see the divine image. If a man were to look into your mirror, he would see a man, but he would also see God. This is what the Torah means when it says, God created the Adam in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. God is like the mirror. God remains the same, but reflects each of our images differently, men and women, young and old. This is why, when we study together, we can reveal different facets of the Torah to each other. Each of us is a different reflection of the One. The women were silent, and for a long time they looked into their mirrors without speaking. Then one of the women said, "These mirrors are holy now because each of them has held God's image. We can no longer use them for ourselves. They belong to everyone." Some of the women were angry at this, for their mirrors were precious to them. But another woman said, "The people are all donating their most precious possessions of the building of the tabernacle and its instruments. Let us give our mirrors to become part of God's dwelling place. Then their holiness will be honored by all the people." Miriam smiled, for she was very pleased by her students' words. Then Miriam said, "Let the mirrors be used to make the bronze laver that the priests will use to wash their faces and feet and hands. At each washing, they will look into the water and they will see God's image. In this way, the mirrors will teach the priests what they have taught us." Even the most grudging of the women consented to this plan, and each one gave her bronze mirror to be smelted for the priestly laver. And when the tabernacle finally was finished, Moses arranged the tabernacle, its curtains, its altar, its incense, and its lamp. The divine presence settled upon the tabernacle and shone radiantly throughout the camp. The women gathered and peered into the courtyard where the polished laver stood before the door of the tent of meeting. They made a covenant with one another to return again and again to the door of the tent of meeting to pray, to study, and to see their faces in the basin made from their mirrors. And in that company, Miriam was often heard to teach. Because of the one God's many images, the Eternal is called Adonai Tsevaot, Lord of hosts. And some say Adonai Tzovot, God of the women who serve the divine dwelling place. So, what is beneath the dash that she has written to this? Exodus 38:8 reads as follows. Moses made the laver of copper and its stand of copper from the mirrors of the women who performed tasks at the entrance of the tent of meeting. What mirrors? What women? The text of Exodus, which describes the making of the tabernacle furniture, tells us nothing to explain this obscure reference. Bible scholars have made a number of suggestions. Edward Greenstein, a modern biblical scholar, suggests that perhaps these women are being punished for some sexual sin, since in 1 Samuel 2:22, a pair of corrupt priests are having sex with these women, the Tzovot. or serving women? Are the women ritual prostitutes, or are they simply pious women who want to gather and pray at the tent of meeting? The rabbinic midrash on the subject tells us that these women were pious Israelites who wanted to make a gift to the tabernacle. Moses wanted to refuse their mirrors because they pandered to feminine vanity. God, however, told Moses to accept the gifts of the women because they had used the same mirrors to make themselves beautiful in Egypt, to arouse their exhausted and depressed husbands, and to cheer them. The sexuality of these women, the Midrash implies, is not to be rejected as unholy. I like the Midrash, but it is incomplete for me since it addresses only one kind of pious woman and one kind of sexuality. I wanted to imagine the mirrors as coming from all sorts of Israelite women. There is another obscure reference in this section of the Bible to the women who spun the wool for the hangings of the tabernacle. They are called wise-hearted women, meaning that they are skilled in artistic crafts. I was curious about these women who had contributed their wise-hearted work to the creation of a dwelling place for God. I wondered if they might not be the same women as the Sovot, and I wondered if they were involved in the study of Torah, in addition to the physical labor of building the Mishkan, the divine dwelling place. I also wondered if Miriam was among them. The mirrors was an answer to my questions about these mysterious women, in which I imagined their generous gift as being the result of their Torah study. The mirrors gave me a chance to meditate on one of the central aspects of my theology, which is the idea that everyone is created in the image of God. We are specifically told in Genesis 1:27 that both men and women have this distinction. This is a good proof text for the equality of the sexes and the right of each person to respectful treatment. Both the mirror and the water basin provide an opportunity to see the physical self. In the rabbinic midrash, this is Moses' objection to the women's donation. Yet the physical self, with its needs and desires, is also a reflection of God. Perhaps by making the lavar of mirrors, the women were able to remind Moses and the priests of that fact. The last line of the story refers to a common biblical name for God, Adonai Tsevaot, or God of hosts. The word hosts is spelled in the same way as hosting women, or Sovot. When I hear the name of the Lord of hosts invoked in synagogue, I remember the women who gave their mirrors to the tabernacle. And I remember that God is their God, the God of divine images and human bodies. So, there's somebody else. Hello. That's the first story. And the second story that I picked is the way that she's written this book. She's divided it into sections with stories in each section. And this one comes from the section, The House of the Judges. And it's called, And the Walls Came Tumbling Down. And the quotes at the beginning, the first one is, "The men said to her, 'Our lives are pledged to yours, even to death. If you do not disclose this mission of ours, we will show you true loyalty when the Lord gives us the land. When we invade the country, tie this length of crimson cord to the window through which you let us down.'" And that's from Joshua 2:14-18. Second quote. Rachav the prostitute converted and married Joshua. Joshua did not have sons, but he had daughters. 8 prophets who were also priests came from Rachav the harlot. That's from the Megillah 14b. The story. They fought all the time. They fought over what to name the coconut brown cows that the Israelites herded through the wilderness. They fought over what to call their daughters. They fought over whether it was too hot to use the red woolen blanket that Joshua had taken from Egypt. They fought over whether it was wrong to have sex for money. whether it was wrong to attack Canaanite villages without warning, and whether it mattered in the greater scheme of things, whether she went to the ritual bath or not. The truth was, they liked fighting. It seemed to address some deep need they had. It gave them something to do in the evening after Joshua's generals had gone home. But in the spring, around the time of the anniversary of the Battle of Jericho, it always seemed to get nasty. Joshua would disappear for days in the hills around the camp scouting, or so he said. Rachav would sulk in the tents of her relatives, claiming her mother was ill or that her younger sister needed advice on how to deal with Israelite men. Their daughters would go and hide with their friends, or they would bring poppies from the fields, hoping to smooth things over. For both Joshua and Rachav, springtime stirred up harsh memories. Joshua began to remember his youth. He thought of his days in Moses' tent. He thought of the massacre of the golden calf. And he thought of how 10 of his good friends, the men with whom he had gone to scout Canaan, the men with whom he had shared waterskins, had faded away, become shadows, and died while he and Caleb remained healthy and strong. That had been their punishment for not trusting God, for claiming the land was full of giants. Joshua somehow wondered if his friends just hadn't had the stomach for war. Because of their bad report, the people had wandered into the wilderness for 40 years. Joshua's own father had died sometime during those years. Joshua couldn't forgive himself for having been so unconvincing to the rebels. If only he had been able to make them listen to him. Rachav had other problems. In the spring, she began to think about Jericho. She thought of all the people she could have warned of the Israelite attack if she hadn't been so concerned with saving herself and her family. She had been so grateful that she had discovered those Israelite soldiers, that she had been able to make a deal. She had lied to her friends, her family, for weeks. She hadn't even told her sisters. She had invited all her loved ones to her inn for a family celebration. Uncle Orev, who was mad at everyone and who disapproved of Rachav's profession, refused to come. She'd heard from an Israelite soldier that how he had died. At the last minute, Rachav had opened her door and gathered in everyone she could. The neighbors' children, the man delivering goat's milk to the elderly women down the street, the tax collector, the midwife, and the new mother in the shanty leaning against the city wall. She'd still been ashamed when the Israelite soldiers marched them out of the city in front of everyone else, in front of all the people of Jericho who were about to be killed. "Traitor!" one young boy had yelled at her. "Collaborator!" It was Joshua who struck down the boy, and it was Joshua who cursed anyone who ever tried to resettle Jericho. Afterward, the Israelites had not known what to do with Rachav and her family. Their presence seemed to put a damper on the victorious celebrations. The priests treated them like one of the mixed multitude, and the mixed multitude treated them like foreigners. The zealous treated them like proof of God's existence. They tried to rebuild their lives at the edge of the Israelite camp. They learned about their new God, their new history. They tried to imagine Sinai. They tried to imagine Egypt. When Joshua began to court Rachav, she thought it was the most bizarre case of displaced aggression or displaced guilt she'd ever seen. Still, she was attracted to him. Apparently, she was displacing something herself. She married him. She even fell in love with him, although she would never admit this to her mother, who was angry enough as it was. Rachav and Joshua couldn't talk about their past, so they fought. Rachav had a daughter after another daughter after another daughter. Joshua thought this was some kind of revenge against the war effort. On this particular occasion, Rachav was pregnant for the 5th time. They'd been fighting over what to name the baby, a common flashpoint. Their other daughters had gone out to the well to escape their shouting. "I will not name my child after Moses," Rachav insisted, "even if it's a boy." Joshua threw down the leather scabbard he was mending. He was my teacher. He was like a father to me. Can't you understand that? Rahav began wiping out a speckled stone cooking pot. He brought you people here. What's that supposed to mean? Where's here? Joshua was shocked. Neither he nor Rahav ever spoke about the conquest itself. They only thought about the details. Rahav was breaking the rules. Canaan, my home, or have you forgotten? Rahav scraped the bottom of the pot with her fingernails. Joshua winced. It's my home now, too, he insisted. He picked up the scabbard again and jabbed a needle into it. Because you stole it, Rahav went on scraping. God gave it to us, Joshua shouted. That's very convenient. Rahav went to the door of the tent and turned the cooking pot upside down and shook it vigorously. Joshua threw the scabbard down again and followed her. Rahav, you have to believe in God. God saved your life. Joshua's wife sighed. Yes, I suppose I believe in God, but I don't feel saved. Why not? Joshua asked her. He lowered his voice. Don't you want the life we have together? Of course I do, but Joshua, you know what I should have done. What should you have done? I should have told them. I should have warned my people about the invasion. Joshua took a deep breath. Rahav, we've been through this. If you had warned them, Jericho would still have fallen and you would have been killed too. That's not the point. I would have been doing the right thing. Joshua began shouting again. How can it not be the point? You saved yourself and your family, not to mention assorted other people I didn't even agree to save. Well, thank you for sparing a few more lives, Rachel said sarcastically. Rahav. Don't tell me what to think. It's your fault Jericho was destroyed. Joshua crossed his arms over his chest. They should have negotiated with us. Rahav threw the cooking pot onto the ground where it burst like a noisy grape. Why couldn't you have been afraid like everyone else? What? Joshua shoved at the pieces of the pot with his foot. Like all the other spies, why couldn't you and Caleb have been afraid too? Why couldn't you have told Moses you were afraid of the size of our armies or something? Isn't that what the other 10 spies did? Then God would have destroyed my people. Why is God so interested in destroying people? Rahav bent double. Oh my God! A stain appeared on the front of her linen dress. What is it? Joshua put his hand on his wife's shoulder. Rahav, what's wrong? Rahav crouched down and put her hand on her back. I'm in labor. I'll get the midwife. No, I'm having the baby now. The midwife from Jericho is all the way across the camp. I'll get a different midwife. Stay here. Rahav moved gingerly to the slate blue rug that covered the floor of the tent. I need you to catch the baby. Though Joshua had felt uncomfortable on many battlefields, the idea of delivering a baby made him feel very nervous. What do I do? Rahav gripped her husband's shoulders and began to bear down. Do you mean to tell me you've never seen me deliver? After 4 children, you never even peeked? Childbirth should be attended by women, Joshua stammered. It wouldn't be a bad thing if you knew how hard it is to bring someone into the world, Rahav gasped. Maybe then you wouldn't remove people from the world every time they get in your way. The people of Israel need a place to live, Rahav. Joshua's forehead was running with sweat, but he couldn't wipe it. He was supporting Rahav by the waist. I know that, Joshua, I know that. I just want you to think about what it's like to be me and my family. Rahav's face squeezed into itself until it looked like a red sponge. She bore down harder. Oh, God! Joshua would never understand how he knew to dip his broad hands down and catch the baby before she fell. There was a high-pitched cry. Rahav's smile split her face. Is it a girl? She asked. It's a girl, he said to her. He held the crying baby in his arms and gently cut her umbilical cord with the knife from his belt. He tied off the cord with a red thread he pulled from the old rope Rachel still used to tie her belongings together. Then he wiped the newborn with a linen cloth. Good, Rahav said. I prayed for a girl. So did I, said Joshua. You did? Rachav squeaked as she reached out for her daughter. After 4 girls? I have a hard time getting close to my disciples, Joshua admitted. We only talk about war. He put the baby on Rachav's chest. Somehow, it's easier with my daughters. Rachav thought for a moment. The baby nuzzled Rachav with her tiny nose and began to nurse. So, what are we going to name her? I told you I'm not naming her after Moses. What if we call her Yariach? Joshua asked gently. After the moon? After Jericho, Joshua said, as a remembrance. Rachev looked at her husband, her eyelids puffy and swollen. I love you so very much. She was still sweating. Joshua went to the door of the hot tent and threw it open. Clouds stretched across the reddening sky in thick, fleecy yarns. As a sign, it was even better than a rainbow. So that is the story. And you can look also at what she has to say about this. Opposites attract, but it is hard to imagine that they attract enough to bring together a prostitute from Jericho with an Israelite general who has just slaughtered everyone else in her city. Yet that's what the rabbis imagine about Joshua and Rachav, or Rahab. Rachav, we must recall, saves 2 Israelite spies from the guards of Jericho who are pursuing them. She does this on condition that when the Israelites conquer the city and destroy it, they will spare her and her family. Rahab believes that God is on the side of the Israelites, and her belief is rewarded. When the Israelites conquer the city, they bring out Rahab and all the people she has squeezed into her house and spare them. Rahab saves her family, but at the expense of her loyalty to her people. As if to point to this tension, the Bible tells us how Rahab, her mother, father, brothers, everything that belonged to her, and her whole family leave Jericho as everything around them is being destroyed and camp outside the camp of Israel. They have been saved by the Israelites, but they are not Israelites. Their home has been destroyed. One wonders what their presence must mean to the Israelites who had sacked the city. One also wonders about Rahab's relationship to God. Is she grateful to the God she has chosen over her ancestral traditions? Or is she angry at the destruction of Jericho? There was a group of Jews in Jeremiah's time called the Rechabites. The name is spelled differently, but I still wonder whether the descendants of Rachav were set apart even then by the harrowing Noah-like experience in their past. Closed into a single house so that they could be spared while those around them perished. A rabbinic midrash develops Rahab's character so that she is even more complex than she first appears to be. In midrash, Joshua is one of the spies who comes to Jericho and stays with Rahab the harlot. Apparently, Joshua is very taken with this harlot because the Talmud teaches that Rahab the prostitute converted and married Joshua. That the rabbis would marry Joshua to a former prostitute, a woman whose city Joshua destroyed, is extraordinary. It is equally extraordinary that she would consent to marry him. How could Rahab have married Joshua, the enemy of Jericho? What did they have to talk about? And there is a further surprise. The rabbis assert, since we never hear of any male ancestors of Joshua, that Joshua and Rahab had only daughters. But these daughters have a lineage. Their descendants include, among many other worthies, Jeremiah and the prophetess Huldah. The rabbis convert a harlot into the matriarch of a priestly and prophetic clan. Why did the sages tell such stories about Rahab? Perhaps because of her faith in God's power. Or perhaps it is because Rahab keeps Israel honest, as she keeps Joshua honest. She forces us to remember the people who we have pushed aside to become what we are. The story is a birth story because of the legend of Rahab's daughters. but also because of the time of entering Canaan was a kind of birth for Israel. Like all births, it entailed struggle and hardship. The Israelites did not enter an empty land. There were people in it, and the relationships between Israelites and other peoples were often hostile. Joshua destroyed Jericho and killed the people in it, and the rabbis tell us he woke up every morning beside one woman who could immediately remind him of this act. Alicia Ostriker writes in her poem, The Story of Joshua, I give you the secret knowledge that you are doing wrong. Perhaps one way Joshua might have received that knowledge was through Rachav. The Talmud does not give Joshua's daughters names, but I have called the youngest Yariach, after Jericho itself. What better way to remind him of the reality of war and of the necessity of peace? So, those are the two stories that I picked for today, and I hope you enjoyed them.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Stop the recording now, but we can talk about it then.
Oh, there we are.